My name is Nkosi. I'm an architect and urban designer here in Atlanta. And I've been in Atlanta since the 4th of July in 1979. I run a couple of organizations. One is Liquid Studios, which is a network of consultants from around the country built up over my network of 25 years. But before that, I started out, finished high school here in Atlanta, and then left for college and went to Hampton University in Virginia. Studied architecture for 5 years, came back, worked with my old man, who's also an architect, and did that for a couple of years before heading off to Chicago for graduate school. And did that for about 3 years, which was interesting. I ran out of money halfway through my graduate studies and had to go find a job. And I'm on the cusp of architects who came after the CAD revolution. So when I was looking in the newspaper for a job, everything said CAD operator, CAD operator, CAD operator. And I'm like, well, I don't do CAD, I still draw by hand. And I saw this one ad that said architectural designer, because I wasn't licensed yet. And it said Dixon, Illinois. And I'm like, where in the world is Dixon, Illinois? So I call these guys and they're like, we're 100 miles west of Chicago. And I was like, wow, okay, I need a job. So hopped in my car and drove 25 miles out to Naperville. And once you pass Naperville, it's like 75 miles of cornfields. And I get to this town and I see this archway and it says, welcome to Dixon, Illinois, the hometown of Ronald Reagan. And I said, oh boy, this is going to be a short interview. And anyway, went and worked with these guys, McLean Searcy Architects. Interviewed with them. They offered me the job on the spot, at least for the summer. And that was a good relationship. Anyway, when that ended, I did find a job in the Loop, which was a little easier when I was going to school. I ended up finishing at the Illinois Institute of Technology and came back to Atlanta. So when I really got back here in '91, started working with my old man again and decided to start my own firm. I had a bigger focus around urban design and urban planning and started the MXD Collaborative. The Historic District Development Corporation was my first client in cooperation and collaboration with, back then it was Nations Bank, now Bank of America. And one of my first projects was the Martin Luther King Historic District. And I did their implementation plan. Anyway, did that in the 90s. And then I ran into a woman named Hattie Dorsey who wanted me to map all of the projects for the Olympics. Nobody was doing that. The city of Atlanta wasn't doing it, the planning department, CODA wasn't doing it, and then ACOG. So nobody was mapping all of these projects and the world was coming. This was '94 when I was asked to do this. And she asked me, you know, could you map these projects? And I said, yeah, sure, can do that. So there were about 250 projects going on in the Olympic ring. So all of the community development corporations, DOT, CODA, their projects, ACOG, obviously all the Olympic projects, City of Atlanta, just kind of every project. So we did a database and also did this Times of Change. We did this giant 8-foot by 8-foot map, you know, with stickers on it where all these projects were, and then developed this paper database of those projects. So anyway, that's part of this bigger vision that I have for urban planning. So did that, and then in the late 90s, she called me back to do more work. And this was around racial equity work and people in the city. Post-Olympics, McKinsey had done a study that said in order for Atlanta to be competitive with its peer cities, I think it was 23 other peer cities, it would have to attract 65,000 new residents back to Atlanta. And people were still kind of leaving the city. And we said, wow, that's a hard nut. At least at the time it seemed like it would be one. So she asked me to do work with the former planning director, Leon Eplin at that time, to come up with a strategy to do that. And we came up with a business case. We called it Making the Case for Mixed Income Communities. And actually, by 2004, we produced our first document in that space. And it stayed #1 on Google until like 2012. Right? And it's been a reference document for a lot of other communities doing mixed income strategies. We made a business case for why it was important to do mixed income housing, not just it was the right thing to do, it wasn't a soft sell, it was an economic argument. Anyway, I had received a $750,000 grant from the Ford Foundation for that work through this organization, through the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership. But it was a match requirement, 1-to-1. They give me $750, but I had to raise $750. And through Hattie Dorsey and her magic, this woman raised like $60 to $80 million over 16 years from private sources. She was just a miracle worker. We tapped every source we had, and we were going along really well until my last $125,000. And I'm like, where am I going to get $125,000 from? And anyway, I was asked to come speak in Washington, D.C. on this panel, and I'm like, okay, fine. I fly up to D.C., I'm on this panel with 3 other people, and I'm talking about the Mixed Income Communities Initiative. And there was a woman there talking about health, public health, and a couple other people. Anyway, we all finished, and I'm like ready to beeline back to the airport to get back to Atlanta. And this woman stopped me, Dr. Gail Christopher, and she said, excuse me, tell me more about this mixed income strategy that you were doing in the business case. And I told her a little more than what I told the audience. And she said, well, how do you get your funding? And I said, well, most of it's come from the Ford Foundation. And, I was just making conversation. And I said, I'm about $125,000 short. And she said, if you can do for public health what you've managed to do for mixed income housing, I'll give you $125,000. And that's how the universe works, right? So we added a public health component to making the case for mixed income communities, the next generation, which was published in 2007 before I left for New Orleans. And so again, since that takes us to New Orleans, I was asked by Angela Glover Blackwell at PolicyLink in California to look at being a loaned executive in the city of New Orleans. And did that. It was supposed to be a 1-year assignment. It turned into 2.5 years. So that was a good experience working in the city. That was my first time working in city government. I finished up in summer of '09. I wrote an exit paper talking about how a lot of young people who had come to volunteer post-Katrina, that folks were not taking seriously, were going to stay, and within 10 years they would be voting and changing the city, and here we are 10 years later, and that's pretty much what's about happened. But anyway, so Kellogg picked up my work, so I've been there in and out since 2007. It's been 10 years. Actually, February made 10 years. Anyway, I'm not quite sure how much people know about the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, but they have a big program around racial equity and healing work. And I attended quite a few gatherings around that issue, America Healing. And in hearing the stories of people who had challenges, very successful, people, had challenges around their upbringing, the things that they faced in life, some really tear-jerking stuff, literally. I had to run out the room and get Kleenex for people facilitating some of these meetings. I said, we need a way to capture experiences for people to heal, right, in some form or fashion. And this was like 2013. And I said, what if there were an app for capturing experiences and mapping those experiences? So I was combining 2 parts of my life, my architectural urban planning life with the mapping, and then this idea around racial equity and healing. Like, how do I merge those 2 things that I do? And went online, looked up some off-the-shelf application software, and found an app called Mobile Roadie. Went in there, and I'm starting to set up what I'm envisioning in my mind what this app should look like, and there was no map. I didn't see like a Google map or anything to drop pins on. So I called them up, and I said, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. And at the time, I said, I don't want to give people my secret sauce, but at the same time, I need to explain enough, you know, so they can tell me, am I on the right track? Is it even doable? So I'm explaining somewhat what I'm trying to do to this guy on the phone, and he said, no, you can't do that with our software off the shelf. And from what you're describing to me sounds like a $200,000 to $250,000 project coded from scratch. And I was like, whoa, it wasn't in the budget. Didn't have a budget. And so anyway, I kind of dropped the idea. It was brewing in the back of my mind, but I just kind of let it go. Anyway, time goes by, 2013 turns into 14, turns into 15. This time last year in 2016, or in about January, I said, you know what? It's been over 2 years, and that's a lifetime in technology. And either maybe they've added a mapping function, because I gave them such a great idea, or the price has dropped, right? So I go back into my account's still there, and I'm pulling up stuff, I still don't see a map. Call again. Of course, I talked to somebody different 2 years later, and again, I'm explaining what I'm trying to do. The guy said, no, can't do that with our software. Let me put you in touch with our parent company in Palo Alto, California, that builds apps from scratch. And I'm thinking, oh boy, Palo Alto, this is going to cost me a fortune. Anyway, vice president of sales called, and this is Intellectsoft is the name of the company. And I'm looking at them online. They build for Disney, Pixar, Range Rover, Harley Davidson. I'm like, I'm not going to be able to afford these guys. Anyway, calls me up. We talked through it. They signed an NDA. I sent them my sketches, told them what I wanted to do. They came back with $65,000. I was like, I will pay for this myself. You know, I had saved some money. You know, that was one of the reasons I fired this back up. But at the time I said, you know what, I will have been in practice for 25 years. And I want to give people who usually don't have an opportunity to invest in something like this to do it. So I said, I'm gonna give up 25%. So I reached out to friends in my network, in my immediate and distant network, extended network. And I reached out to about 500 people. I ended up with about 45 investors, and 85% are African American. And in the past year of doing this, I've realized there's really something about a 10% rule. You talk to 10 people, 3 will be interested, you get 1, right? And anyway, the guy started working on the app for me. And I'm working with these guys, and they're like monsters. I mean, they're just cranking, right? And I sent them all my sketches, and they said, do you design apps? I'm like, I'm an architect. Kind of principles are the same, so I sketched everything out, sent it. Anyway, they started working on it, and we had a goal to launch in September, version 1, minimum viable product, and did that. And the reason I wanted to do this, again, not just the mapping piece or the racial equity, and my investors, people who actually signed on, like myself, are mission driven, right? They get it, because what the app is, it's called MiRialiti, and it's spelt differently so we could trademark it. We built it for Android and iOS. And it's a way, again, for mapping experiences, mapping and tracking these experiences. And being mission driven, you know, I've started to move towards looking at investors who are more seed and angel investors. And the challenge I'm having with that is most folks aren't mission driven. They're profit driven. And it's like, how do we get the user base up to like 100,000 so you'll be on the radar of a Google or a Facebook, and their goal is, hey, pump it up, sell it, move on, which is fine, but that's not what we intended the app to be. At least that's not what I intended it to be. Even looking at my 10% rule, of my 45 investors, I think there are about 4 who are in that space, right? Come off of Wall Street, and they're looking for that big return one day. But anyway, this is an opportunity with this app to be able to map and track experiences anywhere, anytime. It's not dependent on place, right? So people have looked at it and called it Yelp for life. as an example, and I also had a guy who worked for Microsoft in Romania look at the app. He was visiting a colleague here in Atlanta, and she had asked me to come by and explain to her last summer, what are you doing? You know, show me this app. And she said, I have a friend. She had worked at IBM for 35 years, and he used to work there as well. And she said, well, he's in town. He may want to see what you're working on. And I'm thinking, while the app is under development, do I want somebody from Microsoft looking at what I'm building? Anyway, didn't want to be rude. Went through my deck. I've got like a 50-slide deck. And this guy's giving me nothing. I'm getting poker face this whole presentation. When I finished, he said, congratulations, there's nothing like this in the world. She said, well, who's the competition? He said, he'll have competition, but it's fragmented. Yelp, kind of restaurants and some other things they're branching off into, hotels.com, you know, everybody's kind of in these buckets. He said, if you can have an app that's anywhere, you could be on a sidewalk, a baseball game, football game, police station, voter registry, you know, voting, anywhere. He was like, there's nothing like that. Right? So that was encouraging. So we built and built. We launched our version 1 October 7th, and we're on version 3. Version 3, we got to that by December. And that's where we are now with this app. And we are excited. Things are picking up with it, possibly through this work with Georgia State. Some other colleges and universities are showing interest in it as well. We've got some media organizations as well. And yeah, everything in the last like 45 days is like kicked in. So the holidays, I think, is if there's a lesson there, is don't release around the holiday. Nobody's paying attention. It really didn't start picking up until like February, March, which was about a year after I started this process. So that's how I got here. And I hope that students who end up using this app this summer enjoy it and give us great feedback. We are in the beta testing stage, so all the information and feedback we can get, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.